I am Simone, 34 years old, and my body still carries the scars of the night my husband chose his first love's birthday cake over the lives of our unborn triplets. As the CEO of Vanguard Logistics, an empire I built in secret, while he thought I managed a struggling local delivery fleet, I had the power to crush him financially at any moment. Yet as I lay bleeding out on a hospital gurney, realizing he had turned off his phone while my life slipped away, my money could not stop the hemorrhage. Before I reveal how I stripped him and his entitled family of everything they held dear, let me know in the comments where you started reading. Please like and subscribe if you have ever had to break the curse of being the strong black woman who carries everyone else's dead weight. The relentless shrieking of the fetal heart monitor pierced the cold air of the emergency room. My vision blurred at the edges as another wave of agonizing pain ripped through my abdomen. I was 34 weeks pregnant with triplets, and the sheets beneath me were already soaked in dark, terrifying red. Dr. Evans, her face pale behind her surgical mask, pressed a clipboard against my chest. She needed Marcus, my husband of 5 years, to sign the consent forms for an emergency, high-risk cesarean section. Without his signature hospital policy and the massive liability of my complicated medical history meant they could not put me under general anesthesia until I lost a critical amount of blood. My hands shook violently as I dialed his number for the 15th time. The phone rang, echoing in the sterile room before someone finally answered. It was not Marcus. Seriously, Simone? The annoyed sigh on the other end belonged to Heather, my white sister-in-law, who had somehow made a career out of living off Marcus's tech startup while treating me like the hired help. Marcus is literally in the middle of singing happy birthday to Vanessa. Could your timing be any worse? Vanessa was his high school sweetheart, the woman who always played the fragile victim while keeping Marcus wrapped around her finger. I gritted my teeth, tasting the metallic tang of blood in my mouth as another contraction hit me. Heather, give him the phone. I am hemorrhaging. The babies are dying. I need him here right now. A sharp, dismissive laugh crackled through the speaker, dripping with the kind of casual cruelty I had endured for years. Oh, please, you are always doing this. Marcus warned us you would try to ruin Vanessa's special night because you cannot stand seeing him happy. Why do you always have to play the angry, jealous black woman? Just take an Uber to the clinic and let him enjoy one night without your constant drama. The line went dead. The dial tone buzzed in my ear like a swarm of hornets. I stared at the phone, my vision swimming as the sheer weight of what had just happened crashed into me. He had given her his phone to screen my calls. My husband, the man whose failing tech startup I had secretly been keeping afloat with anonymous cash injections, the man whose lazy brother and entitled sister-in-law I had carried on my back financially, was cutting a cake with his ex-girlfriend while I was bleeding out on a hospital bed. A cold, absolute clarity washed over me, freezing the panic that had been suffocating me for the last 20 minutes. The illusion of my marriage shattered into a million irreparable pieces. I looked up at Dr. Evans, who was frantically checking my plunging blood pressure. Give me the pen. I rasped, my voice completely devoid of emotion. She hesitated, looking at the empty space where my husband should have been standing to protect me. Simone, if you sign this medical proxy waiver yourself in this condition, you are absorbing 100% of the liability if you do not make it. We need his authorization to proceed safely. I snatched the pen from her trembling hand and slashed my signature across the bottom of the form with a ferocity that tore the paper. Do it, I commanded, locking eyes with her. Save my children. I will save myself. The next few hours were a chaotic blur of blinding operating room lights, the sharp sting of anesthesia, and the terrifying sensation of being cut open. I drifted in and out of a dark, heavy void, tethered to the living world, only by the desperate need to hear my babies cry. When I finally drifted back to consciousness, the harsh fluorescent lights had been replaced by the dim, quiet glow of the intensive care unit. The steady, rhythmic beeping of the monitors told me I was alive. A nurse with gentle eyes leaned over me, whispering that my 2 boys and 1 girl were small but fighting hard in the neonatal intensive care unit. They had made it. I had made it. But the Simone who had been wheeled into that operating room, the woman who had spent years shrinking herself to protect the fragile egos of her husband and his parasitic family, died on that operating table. I did not reach for my phone to call Marcus. I did not cry for the husband who had abandoned me to die. Instead, I carefully lifted my phone and dialed a private unlisted number that nobody in my husband's family knew existed. It rang only once before a crisp, professional voice answered. Vanguard Executive Office, Mr. Sterling speaking. I took a slow, painful breath, feeling the stitches pull tight across my abdomen. Sterling, it is Simone. Initiate Protocol 0 immediately. I need a private medical transport helicopter on the roof of Mercy General Hospital within the hour. Secure a private VIP wing at the Sinclair Medical Institute under a strict non-disclosure agreement. Furthermore, contact our legal team and tell them to begin the asset liquidation process for my husband's startup. Sterling did not pause to ask questions. Understood, Madam CEO. And what about your current residence? I looked at the empty chair beside my hospital bed, the chair where my husband should have been sitting to welcome his children into the world. A chilling smile spread across my face. Empty it, I said coldly. Leave nothing but the dust. 4 days later, Marcus adjusted the collar of his designer jacket and stepped out of his rideshare in front of Mercy General Hospital. He casually gripped the string of a single foil balloon that read, "Welcome, baby," completely ignoring the fact that he was supposed to be the father of 3 new infants, not one. He checked his gold watch, irritated by the inconvenience of it all. He had a golf outing scheduled with a potential investor in 2 hours, and he fully intended to make it. In his mind, Simone was just throwing another one of her typical tantrums. She always had to make everything about herself. He walked into the maternity ward, projecting the arrogant confidence of a man who believed the world revolved around his schedule. The reception area was bustling with expectant fathers carrying massive floral arrangements and giant plush toys. Marcus rolled his eyes at the display and approached the front desk, bypassing a young couple. "I am here for Simone," Marcus announced, leaning heavily against the high counter. "She was admitted 4 days ago. I need her room number and please tell her to hurry up with whatever routine she is doing. I have a very tight schedule today." The stern receptionist looked up from her computer monitor, blinking at the cheap balloon bobbing against the ceiling tiles. "Last name?" she asked, her tone entirely devoid of the deference Marcus felt he deserved. "Marcus," he replied, tapping his fingers impatiently on the countertop. "My wife is Simone. Look, I know she probably threw a fit when I missed Tuesday night, but honestly, she is just being dramatic. I needed one night to celebrate a friend's birthday without her nagging. Ever since I took a tiny fraction of our family savings to pay off my brother's wife's college debt, Simone has been looking for any excuse to play the victim. Heather needed that money to keep up appearances, and my wife is just using this pregnancy to trap me in a guilt trip." The receptionist stopped typing, her expression hardening into absolute disgust. She stared at him for a long moment before turning back to her screen. "Room 412, she said coldly. "Down the hall, take a left." "Finally," Marcus muttered under his breath. He grabbed his deflating balloon and strolled down the pristine white corridor. As he approached the intensive care unit, he noticed 2 nurses standing by a medication cart speaking in animated whispers. "I have never seen anything like it in my 20 years here," the first nurse said, shaking her head. She was losing so much blood, but her eyes were like ice. She just grabbed the pen and signed the high-risk waiver herself. No hesitation. The second nurse shivered. "And the transport team, they swarmed the roof less than an hour after she woke up. A private helicopter, the works. I heard she is actually a billionaire CEO. Whoever her husband is, he must be the dumbest man on the planet to leave a woman like that bleeding out alone." Marcus chuckled quietly to himself as he walked past them. He assumed they were talking about some celebrity hiding out in the VIP wing. It certainly had nothing to do with his life. His wife was just a stubborn woman running a modest local delivery fleet, a woman who needed a reality check about respect and family loyalty. He pushed open the door to room 412. "All right, Simone, I am here," Marcus announced loudly, stepping into the room. "You can drop the silent treatment now. Let us get this over with so I can get back to work." He stopped dead in his tracks. The hospital bed was meticulously made, the monitors turned off. The small bassinet in the corner was empty. The room smelled strongly of bleach. There were no flowers, no baby clothes, no signs that anyone had occupied the space in days. "What is this?" Marcus asked aloud, his voice dropping as genuine confusion finally pierced his arrogant facade. "Did they move her?" A senior charge nurse stepped into the doorway behind him, blocking his exit. She looked at Marcus with a mixture of pity and intense disdain. "Are you the husband?" she asked, her voice sharp and professional. "Yes," Marcus snapped, spinning around to face her. "Where is my wife? Did she throw a fit and demand a bigger room? Because I am not paying for a premium upgrade." The nurse did not flinch. She stepped forward, her eyes locking onto his. "Your wife does not need you to pay for anything, sir. And she is not in this hospital. She discharged herself and the triplets 4 days ago." Marcus stared at her, struggling to process the words. The balloon slipped from his fingers, bumping against the ceiling. 4 days ago? That is impossible. She just had major surgery. Where is she? Why is she not at home? "I have no idea where she went," the nurse replied coldly, turning to leave. "But considering you did not even bother to show up while she was fighting for her life, I am not surprised she did not leave a forwarding address. Have a nice day." She walked away, leaving Marcus alone in the empty room. Panic finally began to claw at his chest. Simone had actually left. She had taken his children and vanished. He frantically pulled out his phone, intending to call his mother to see if Simone had shown up to complain. Before he could unlock the screen, a loud buzz vibrated against his palm. A high-priority notification flashed across his screen from his elite banking application. It was an automated alert from the issuer of his joint black credit card, the account tied to what he believed were their shared marital assets. Marcus squinted at the screen, his heart pounding erratically against his ribs. The notification read, "Transaction failed. Account permanently frozen due to suspicious insolvency." Marcus stared at the glowing screen of his smartphone, his mind violently rejecting the words displayed before him. Suspicious insolvency. The phrase echoed in his head like a death knell. He tapped the screen frantically, attempting to refresh the banking application, but the red banner remained stubbornly fixed. This black card was his financial lifeline, the primary source of funding that maintained his carefully crafted illusion of being a highly successful tech visionary. It paid for his tailored suits, the lavish dinners with Vanessa, and the constant stream of cash he secretly funneled to his mother and his brother's wife. Panic, cold and incredibly sharp, finally pierced his thick armor of arrogance. He needed to get home immediately. He opened his rideshare application, his hands trembling slightly, and ordered a premium car using a backup personal debit card. The 30-minute drive from the hospital to their upscale suburban neighborhood felt like an absolute eternity. He spent the entire agonizing ride composing furious text messages to Simone, demanding a full explanation for her erratic behavior, but every single message bounced back as undelivered. She had blocked his number entirely. When the black sedan pulled up to his sprawling 4-bedroom colonial house, Marcus practically threw himself out of the vehicle before it fully stopped. The meticulously manicured green lawn and the pristine white columns of the wrap-around porch usually filled him with a deep sense of superiority. But today, the picturesque scene was completely ruined by the presence of two incredibly angry women. His mother Cora and his sister-in-law Heather were standing firmly on the front steps, both wearing tight expressions of profound indignation. Heather was aggressively jiggling the brass handle of the heavy front door, her face flushed dark red with obvious frustration. "Finally, Marcus, you are here," Heather snapped loudly as he jogged heavily up the paved driveway. She crossed her thin arms, her stacked diamond bracelets clinking together sharply. "You seriously need to get your crazy wife under control right now." "I came over today because I am hosting a very important bridal shower for a good friend this afternoon, and I needed to borrow a few bottles of that extremely expensive imported vintage wine Simone keeps hoarding down in the cellar. But my spare key does not work anymore. She actually had the ungrateful nerve to change the locks on her own family." Cora stepped forward, adjusting her designer silk scarf with a loud huff of sheer disapproval. "It is entirely disrespectful, Marcus. I raised you so much better than to let a disobedient woman dictate exactly who has access to this magnificent property. This is your beautiful house bought with the sweat of your brow and your brilliant mind. We are your real family. Simone consistently forgets her proper place in our hierarchy. She thinks because she manages those dirty little delivery trucks that she can disrespect her elders and shut us out completely. I told her just last week that she absolutely needs to contribute far more money to your struggling brother's mortgage, and now she is throwing a massive tantrum, exactly like a bitter, angry woman who hates sharing. Marcus ignored their whining complaints, pushing forcefully past them to jam his own silver key deeply into the deadbolt. It flatly refused to turn. The entire internal locking mechanism had been swapped out for a heavy-duty, high-security electronic keypad. "Simone, open this front door right this instant!" he shouted furiously, pounding his clenched fist hard against the heavy, solid mahogany wood. The loud sound echoed incredibly hollowly, producing a deep, reverberating thud that sent a sudden, terrifying chill slicing straight down his rigid spine. He stepped back quickly and moved swiftly toward the large, expansive bay window that looked directly into their elegant, formal living room. He cupped both hands tightly around his sweating face and pressed his nose flat against the cold glass, straining his eyes to see clearly past the blinding glare of the bright afternoon sun. The quick breath caught painfully in his dry throat. The massive room was entirely empty. It was not just mysteriously missing the expensive imported Italian leather sofa or the sleek modern glass coffee table. The authentic Persian-era rugs were completely gone. The valuable framed artwork had been meticulously stripped from the surrounding walls, leaving behind only faint, pale rectangular shadows on the pristine white paint. He moved frantically, almost stumbling, to the adjacent dining room window, completely empty. The custom-crafted mahogany dining table, the sparkling crystal chandelier, the plush velvet dining chairs. Absolutely everything had thoroughly vanished without a single trace. It was as if a giant vacuum had descended directly from the cloudy sky and forcefully sucked the very structural essence of their 5-year marriage out of the physical living space. She had not left him behind. She had aggressively erased him. "Marcus, what is fundamentally wrong with you? Break a glass window if you have to. I desperately need that specific wine." Heather whined pathetically, her shrill voice rising sharply in pitch as she expertly weaponized her dramatic distress. Fake tears rapidly welled up in her pale eyes, a textbook classic display of fragile white victimhood. "She is just so wildly aggressive, Marcus. She is purposely trying to humiliate me maliciously in front of my wealthy friends. You absolutely have to put her firmly back in her designated place. This behavior is exactly why my own mother strongly warned me about ever marrying into a family with such inherently hostile, uncooperative black women." Before Marcus could reply to her racist insult, a black van arrived. A courier in a sharp suit stepped out, walking past the two women. "Marcus Sterling?" he asked coldly. "Yes," Marcus answered. The man handed him a silver iPad. A video began playing immediately. Simone sat flawlessly inside a sleek boardroom. "You wanted to cut cake, Marcus?" she asked, her voice lethal. "I cut your financial life support. Check your email." Marcus stared at the frozen video on the silver iPad, his mind violently rejecting the lethal words his wife had just spoken. He ripped his smartphone from his designer jacket pocket, his hands shaking uncontrollably as he opened his email application. Sitting at the top of his crowded inbox was a formal, legally binding notice from the premier family law firm in the state. The email detailed an immediate filing for a highly contested divorce and demanded the swift, unconditional repayment of a secret $1 million business loan he thought he had successfully hidden from his wife. Cold, sharp panic flooded his veins, instantly replacing his previous arrogance. Less than an hour later, Marcus kicked open the heavy glass doors of his corporate attorney's upscale downtown office. He had dragged his fragile first love Vanessa and his entitled sister-in-law Heather along as his personal witnesses to what he loudly proclaimed was his wife's sudden, violent mental breakdown. Vanessa clung tightly to his arm, wearing an oversized sweater and an expression of practiced, delicate concern. Heather trailed closely behind them, aggressively tapping on her phone screen and complaining loudly to anyone who would listen about how Simone's sheer audacity had completely ruined her prestigious afternoon bridal shower. I want absolute control over her little delivery truck business as my primary alimony, Marcus demanded, slamming his clenched fist down on the polished mahogany conference table. His high-priced attorney, Richard Vance, blinked in genuine surprise at the sudden chaotic intrusion. Simone has clearly lost her mind today. She emptied my house, froze my black card, and changed the locks on my own family. I am the sole victim here. Vanessa and Heather can testify under oath to her long history of aggressive, unstable behavior. Before Richard could even formulate a legal response or ask for basic context, the heavy double doors of the conference room swung open smoothly. Simone walked in, completely shattering the false narrative Marcus had just desperately tried to construct. She did not look like a grieving, abandoned mother, and she certainly did not look like an unstable woman who had just endured a traumatic, high-risk surgical procedure 4 days ago. She looked utterly flawless. She wore a perfectly tailored crimson business suit, her hair styled in a sleek, powerful bob, and her posture radiated an aura of absolute, terrifying control. Two imposing corporate lawyers in dark suits flanked her on either side like silent sentinels. Heather let out a sharp, condescending scoff, rolling her pale eyes dramatically at the grand entrance. "Oh, look who decided to finally show up," Heather sneered, crossing her thin arms defensively. "Did you manage to sell off a couple of your rusty little delivery trucks to afford those expensive rented lawyers, Simone? You are making a massive fool of yourself. Marcus is the respected chief executive of a tech company, and you are just a bitter woman driving cardboard boxes around the city. You should be down on your knees begging him for a second chance instead of throwing this pathetic, dramatic tantrum." Simone did not even bother to look at Heather. She kept her piercing dark eyes locked entirely on Marcus. She smoothly pulled out one of the heavy leather chairs and sat down at the opposite end of the long conference table. Her lead attorney calmly unclasped a thick black leather briefcase and began placing perfectly organized stacks of financial documents directly in front of Marcus's bewildered lawyer. "I do not own a few rusty delivery trucks, Heather," Simone stated, her voice echoing with a cold, terrifying authority that immediately silenced the entire room. "And I am not here to negotiate a traditional divorce settlement with a man who abandoned his bleeding wife to attend a birthday party." Marcus scoffed loudly, trying desperately to regain his footing and project dominance in front of his attorney. "You own a struggling local courier service, Simone. Do not try to play big leagues in my attorney's office. You have absolutely no leverage here. I am taking half of everything you have." Simone leaned forward, resting her elbows gracefully on the polished wood. "My courier service is merely a shell subsidiary. I am the founder, majority shareholder, and chief executive officer of Vanguard Logistics and Commercial Real Estate." The name dropped like a physical bomb in the center of the room. Marcus's attorney, Richard, visibly recoiled in his chair, his eyes widening in pure shock as he hurriedly scanned the corporate documents placed before him. Vanguard Logistics was a billion-dollar corporate titan in the commercial sector. "That is completely impossible," Marcus stammered, the arrogant smirk finally melting right off his face as the blood drained from his cheeks. "You cannot be Vanguard. Vanguard is the massive venture capital firm that just quietly bought out my startup's failing debt last month." "Exactly," Simone replied, a lethal smile touching the corners of her mouth. "You spent our entire marriage treating me like an uneducated subordinate. You flaunted your flashy tech startup title while secretly running your company directly into the ground. When your board of directors threatened to oust you for massive insolvency, you desperately sought a quiet corporate buyout to save your precious ego. You were so blinded by your own narcissism that you never even bothered to research the actual identity of the private investor who threw you that financial lifeline." Vanessa whimpered softly, shrinking back against the wall as the sheer magnitude of Simone's immense power materialized. Heather stood completely frozen, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, her previous insults hanging awkwardly in the tense, silent air. Simone reached into her crimson blazer and extracted a single crisp piece of paper. She placed her fingertips on the edge of the document and slid it slowly across the smooth expanse of the mahogany table until it rested directly in front of Marcus's trembling hands. This is a comprehensive divorce agreement and a full surrender of all your parental rights to the children you abandoned. Simone announced her tone, leaving absolutely zero room for negotiation or debate. I know exactly how you funded your lavish lifestyle with Vanessa. I know all about the corporate funds you illegally diverted into your personal accounts to cover your mother's mortgage and your sister-in-law's college debts. Marcus stared blindly at the paper, his face twisting in absolute horror. He looked exactly like a man standing on the sudden trapdoor of a gallows. Simone stood up, buttoning her blazer with sharp, deliberate precision. Sign the divorce and full custody papers, or I recall my investment by 5 p.m., and you go to federal prison for embezzlement. The polished marble floors of Vanguard Logistics headquarters usually echoed only with the quiet hum of billion-dollar transactions. Today, the serene atmosphere was violently disrupted. Cora and Heather marched through the revolving glass doors like an invading army demanding immediate surrender. Cora wore her finest Sunday church suit, her chest puffed out with the unearned righteous indignation of a matriarch who believed she was owed the world simply for existing. Heather marched beside her, clutching a designer handbag paid for by my secret labor, exuding arrogant white privilege that assumed every door would automatically open. They approached the mahogany reception desk, ignoring the two imposing security guards stationed nearby. Cora slammed her hand flat against the counter, demanding that the receptionist summon me immediately. She loudly proclaimed she was the mother of the chief executive officer's husband, completely oblivious that her son was facing federal prison time. When the receptionist politely asked them to lower their voices, Heather dramatically rolled her eyes and leaned over the counter. She aggressively tapped her manicured finger on the desk, insisting she knew the owner and the receptionist would be fired if she did not comply instantly. The sheer audacity of their entitlement was suffocating, but it was exactly what I had anticipated. I stood on the second-floor glass balcony watching them throw pathetic tantrums like spoiled children. I adjusted the cuffs of my tailored emerald suit and descended the sweeping glass staircase. The rhythmic click of my heels against the marble finally caught their attention. Cora spun around, her eyes widening for a fraction of a second as she took in the sheer magnitude of the corporate empire I had built right under her nose. But her shock quickly morphed back into aggressive, unyielding entitlement. She stormed toward the bottom of the staircase, pointing an accusing finger directly at my face. Simone, you need to fix this massive mess right now, Cora demanded, her voice echoing loudly off the high ceiling. You froze my son's accounts and left my daughter-in-law locked out of her family wine cellar. You married into this family, and that means your wealth belongs to all of us. It is your duty to share your blessings. We took you in when you were running a few dirty delivery trucks, and you owe us loyalty. You need to bail Marcus out of his financial troubles and transfer the deed of that house directly to Heather today. That is how real family works. I paused on the final step, looking down at the woman who had spent 5 years treating me like a second-class citizen. You did not take me in, Cora, I replied, my voice dangerously calm and perfectly level. I carried your entire family on my back. I paid your mortgage when Marcus secretly diverted my funds. I paid for Heather's culinary degree that she never even used. Your concept of family is a parasitical transaction. You only claim me when you need a bailout, and I am done paying your ridiculous tax. Heather stepped forward, her pale face flushing a deep, angry crimson. She could not handle the reality of a black woman holding absolute power over her comfortable, subsidized life. You are being completely unreasonable and hostile, Simone, Heather whined, her voice rising to a shrill, hysterical pitch. You are just punishing us because you are deeply insecure. We are not leaving this building until you give us the access codes to the bank accounts. I signaled to my head of security, a tall, muscular black man named David, who stepped forward smoothly to block their path. Heather shrank back, clutching her chest as if she had just been physically assaulted. The fake tears materialized, instantly pooling in her eyes as she expertly weaponized her fragility. Do not let him touch me, she shrieked, pulling out her smartphone with trembling hands. I feel incredibly threatened right now. You are acting completely out of control, Simone. You are being aggressive, and I will not tolerate it. I am calling the police right now. I will tell them your violent security team is threatening a defenseless woman. We will see how your company handles a public relations scandal when I tell the media how the angry black chief executive assaulted her family. She held her phone up her thumb, hovering dramatically over the keypad, waiting for me to panic, apologize, and surrender my assets to keep the peace. She expected me to shrink, swallow my pride, and appease her to avoid the systemic trap she was trying to spring on me. I did not move a single inch from my own spot. I did not raise my voice even a tiny fraction. I simply smiled, a slow, freezing smile that made Cora take a hesitant step backward. "Please, Heather, make the call," I said smoothly, gesturing gracefully around the expansive lobby. "But before you dial the authorities with your fabricated story, you might want to look up." I pointed a manicured finger toward the massive digital display screen mounted high on the marble wall above the reception desk. The screen, which usually displayed global shipping logistics, was currently split into two distinct high-definition live video feeds. Heather and Cora turned their heads, their jaws dropping simultaneously in absolute horror. On the left side of the screen, the executive board of Heather's elite country club was watching the feed in stunned silence. On the right, the senior deacons and pastoral staff of Cora's prestigious megachurch were sitting in their weekly meeting, witnessing every second of the unhinged extortion attempt. "I am not panicking, Heather, because I am not the one who needs to explain myself," I announced clearly, my voice ringing out for both the lobby and the live broadcast to hear. "I have been broadcasting your racist threats and Cora's extortion demands for the last 10 minutes. Smile for your respective congregations, ladies. Your true faces are finally on display for the world." The digital screens flickered back to normal logistical data, leaving the corporate lobby in absolute ringing silence. Heather dropped her designer handbag, her pale face draining of all color as her phone immediately began vibrating with frantic calls from the country club board of directors. Cora clutched her chest, no longer faking a medical emergency, but experiencing genuine, profound panic as text messages from her church deacons flooded her screen. Without another word, both women turned and sprinted toward the revolving glass doors, fleeing the building in absolute disgrace. I signaled my security team to stand down, smoothing the lapels of my emerald suit. I had cut the parasites off at the root, but I knew Marcus would not go down without launching a desperate, dirty counterattack. Cornered men with fragile egos always resort to the lowest possible tactics when their financial lifelines are severed. I did not have to wait long for the retaliation. Less than 48 hours later, Vanessa decided to play her ultimate trump card. My phone buzzed with an alert from a popular gossip blog that had somehow caught wind of our high-profile divorce. Vanessa had posted a highly stylized, professionally edited photograph on her public social media accounts. In the image, Marcus was kissing her forehead while she held up a black and white ultrasound printout. The caption was a masterclass in weaponized victimhood and racial microaggressions. She claimed they were expecting a miracle baby, a true heir born from genuine love. She deliberately painted me as the barren, bitter, angry black woman who was using her corporate wealth to maliciously destroy an innocent new family out of sheer jealousy. She wrote paragraphs about how I had cruelly locked Marcus out of his own home and frozen his bank accounts, simply because I could not give him the child he so desperately wanted, completely omitting the fact that I had just given birth to triplets while she was cutting his birthday cake. The internet immediately turned on me. Thousands of comments flooded the post, calling me a vindictive, heartless corporate monster. The societal expectation for black women to quietly swallow betrayal and maintain a dignified silence was suffocating, but I refused to play the role of the tragic, long-suffering wife. I did not issue a public statement. I did not take to social media to defend my character or post pictures of my 3 beautiful babies fighting in the neonatal intensive care unit. Let them think I was the villain. Let Vanessa bask in the false glow of public sympathy. I knew something the internet did not, and I was going to use it to legally bury them both. Emboldened by the wave of public support and desperate for access to my Vanguard accounts, Marcus filed an emergency court injunction the very next morning. His filing was a masterpiece of absolute audacity. He officially requested a judge to grant him immediate, unhindered access to $5 million in spousal support. His legal argument claimed that Vanguard Logistics was marital property, and he urgently needed the liquid funds to provide housing medical care. "I am asking you to be smart for once in your miserable life," Vivian snapped, her composure cracking. "You do not win a war against people who own the battlefield. Victoria's father practically built this city. Her family has judges, senators, and police chiefs on their payroll. You are one black woman with a government badge trying to fight an entire dynasty of old white money. You cannot win, Kendra. You will lose your career, your freedom, and your future if you do not sign those papers right now." Thoroughly convinced that his public relations stunt had effectively cornered me into a swift financial settlement, his attorney stood up and delivered a passionate, tear-jerking monologue about Marcus being a dedicated, hardworking man who was being systematically financially abused by a vindictive spouse. He pleaded with the judge to release the emergency funds, arguing that a pregnant woman and an innocent unborn child should not have to suffer in poverty simply because of a bitter divorce dispute. The judge, an older, stern-looking man, listened intently, his expression growing sympathetic toward Marcus's fabricated plight. He turned his gaze toward my table, demanding to know if I had any justifiable legal reason to deny my husband access to basic living expenses for his growing family. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of anger or frustration. I simply nodded to my attorney, who unclasped his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder sealed with red tape. He walked smoothly across the courtroom and handed the thick folder directly to the judge. "Your Honor," my attorney stated clearly, his voice carrying effortlessly across the silent room, "my client does not deny that her husband is currently seeking funds to support the woman sitting in the gallery. However, my client strongly disputes the legal and biological premise of this emergency injunction. The petitioner is claiming he requires immediate access to my client's corporate assets to provide for his unborn biological heir." Marcus frowned, shifting uncomfortably in his wooden chair. He looked back at Vanessa, whose practiced, delicate weeping had suddenly stopped. "Inside that folder," my attorney continued, gesturing toward the judge's bench, "are certified, legally binding medical records from the Sinclair Urological Institute dated exactly 3 years ago. The petitioner underwent an extensive surgical procedure due to a severe localized infection." I leaned forward, locking my dark eyes entirely on Marcus, watching the exact moment the devastating realization finally clicked in his brain. The color drained completely from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. "Your Honor," I said softly, delivering the final fatal blow, "my husband cannot possibly be the father of the child Vanessa is carrying. As those medical records clearly prove, Marcus suffered a severe medical complication 3 years ago. He is entirely permanently sterile." The courtroom erupted into absolute chaos the moment those words left my mouth. Vanessa let out a piercing shriek, covering her face as reporters scrambled. Marcus collapsed heavily back into his wooden chair, gasping for air like a man drowning in his own deceit. The judge slammed his gavel, dismissing the emergency injunction and ordering Marcus to pay my legal fees. I walked out without looking back, leaving them to drown in their lies. But parasites do not simply die off when you cut their food supply. They scramble to find a new host, or in my husband's case, they throw a party to pretend they are still feasting. 3 weeks later, the crisp November air signaled the arrival of Thanksgiving. Tradition dictated the entire Sterling family gather at Cora's suburban home for a lavish feast. Knowing Marcus's accounts were permanently frozen, I was curious how my estranged husband planned to fund his mother's notoriously expensive holiday extravaganza. My private investigator provided the answer within hours. Marcus had quietly taken out a massive secret loan to cover the catering, premium liquor, and elaborate decorations. He was trying to maintain the fragile illusion of his wealth, hoping to keep his mother and sister-in-law ignorant of his impending federal indictment. It was the perfect stage for my next move. I wore a tailored burgundy trench coat over a sleek black dress, my heels clicking sharply against the concrete as I walked up Cora's manicured driveway. I did not bother to knock. I pushed the heavy oak front door open, stepping right into the bustling foyer. The dining room was packed with extended family members, church deacons, and local socialites. Marcus sat at the head of the massive table carving a perfectly roasted turkey with a forced sweating smile. Vanessa was absent, presumably banished after the courtroom humiliation. Heather sat next to Marcus holding a crystal glass of expensive champagne, wearing a smug expression that instantly dissolved the second she saw me standing in the arched doorway. "What are you doing here?" Cora demanded, dropping a silver serving spoon onto the pristine white tablecloth. The entire room fell into a suffocating silence. "You are not welcome here, Simone. This is a private family dinner for people who actually support each other, not for bitter, hostile women who abandon their husbands during a financial rough patch." I did not wait for any invitation to sit. I pulled out an empty chair directly across from Heather and casually draped my coat over the back. "I am just here for a plate of your famous candied yams, Cora," I said, offering a bright, terrifyingly calm smile to the shocked guests. "And to check on my investments, of course." Heather aggressively cleared her pale throat, eager to seize the spotlight and reassert her fabricated dominance. She gestured grandly toward a massive, elaborate dessert display situated on the antique mahogany sideboard. "Well, since you rudely interrupted, you can at least admire my work. Those artisanal pastries are from my brand new high-end bakery, the Sugar Magnolia. We just had our grand opening in the downtown arts district last week. Marcus was generous enough to secure the primary capital for me before you vindictively locked up his bank accounts. He understands that real sophisticated business requires class elegance and a refined palate." She took a slow, condescending sip of her champagne, eyeing me with pure, unfiltered disdain. "You would not understand anything about high-end commercial spaces, Simone. Driving around a few dusty delivery trucks does not exactly prepare you for the nuanced, complex world of luxury retail. My bakery is located in one of the most exclusive, highly sought-after commercial buildings in the entire city. The management company is incredibly selective about their elite tenants. They certainly would not let someone with your gritty working-class aesthetic anywhere near their pristine property." Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes darting frantically toward the front door. He knew exactly what Vanguard Logistics meant, but he had not connected the dots to my broader commercial real estate holdings. He foolishly thought his latest financial scheme was safely hidden. "You are absolutely right, Heather," I replied smoothly, reaching across the table to spear a small, perfectly glazed piece of turkey with a silver fork. The commercial real estate market in the downtown arts district is exceptionally rigorous. The building management requires strict financial transparency, reliable credit history, and tenants who actually pay their monthly lease on time. I took a slow, deliberate bite of the turkey, chewing it thoughtfully, while the entire dining room watched me in absolute terrified silence. I wiped my mouth with a linen napkin, reached into my sleek designer handbag, and extracted a thick, professionally bound legal document. I tossed it effortlessly across the long mahogany dining table. It landed with a heavy smack right on top of Heather's pristine porcelain dinner plate, knocking over her crystal champagne flute and spilling bubbly liquid all over the expensive white tablecloth. Heather shrieked, jumping back as the champagne soaked the sleeve of her designer dress. "What is wrong with you?" she yelled, grabbing the damp document with trembling, furious hands. "What is this garbage? I strongly suggest you read the header, Heather." I stated, my voice dropping to a lethal, commanding octave that froze the air in the room. Her pale blue eyes scanned the bold black text at the very top of the page. She gasped loudly, the color instantly draining from her face. "Vanguard Real Estate Holdings is the parent company of Vanguard Logistics," I explained cheerfully, resting my chin on my hands. "I own the commercial real estate firm that leases the premium retail space for your bakery. You are exactly 3 months behind on your exorbitant rent, and because Marcus's secret fraudulent business loans just bounced, your grace period has officially expired. Read the bottom line, Heather. That is a formal eviction notice. Your doors will be padlocked at dawn." Heather stared at the bold black text on the legal document, her hands shaking so violently that the spilled champagne dripped from her fingertips onto the expensive hardwood floor. The smug, condescending sneer that had defined her entire existence vanished, replaced by the sheer unadulterated terror of a woman suddenly stripped of her unearned privilege. "You cannot do this to me," she stammered, her voice cracking as she looked wildly around the mahogany table for support. "I signed a lease. I have legal tenant rights. Marcus, tell her she cannot just padlock my doors." Marcus sat completely paralyzed at the head of the table. The carving knife was still gripped tightly in his hand, but his knuckles were stark white. He could not defend her. He could not even defend himself. The realization that Vanguard Real Estate Holdings belonged to me meant that every single corporate lie he had spun over the past month was now completely exposed. I was not a high-powered executive waiting for a strategic buyout. He was a fraud, and I was the executioner holding the axe. The family members and church deacons sitting around the table began murmuring nervously, the festive holiday atmosphere evaporating into thick, suffocating tension. Cora, always the opportunistic survivor, instantly recognized the shifting dynamics of absolute power. The woman who had spent years demanding I sacrifice my dignity to fund her lavish lifestyle suddenly pivoted with breathtaking speed. She lowered her crystal wine glass and turned a sharp, venomous glare toward Heather. "Be quiet, Heather." Cora snapped, her tone dripping with sudden disgust. "You have been bleeding my son dry for years with your ridiculous failing business ventures. You should have known better than to bite the hand that feeds this entire family." Cora turned her desperate gaze toward me, completely ignoring the fact that she had just tried to banish me from her home minutes earlier. She plastered on a sickeningly sweet maternal smile. "Simone, sweetheart, please sit down properly. We are your family. We are just dealing with a minor misunderstanding here. You know how stressful the holidays can be. You do not need to throw away a beautiful marriage over a temporary financial dispute. Marcus has simply made a few foolish mistakes, but he is a good man. You are a strong black woman, Simone. You know it is our sacred duty to hold the family together when the men stumble. If you just drop this ridiculous divorce nonsense and reinstate his bank accounts, I will personally ensure that Vanessa is removed from the picture." I looked at my mother-in-law, marveling at the boundless depths of her manipulative audacity. She was entirely willing to throw her beloved white daughter-in-law under the bus and discard Marcus's pregnant mistress if it meant she could continue cashing my checks. "You want me to hold the family together, Cora?" I asked, my voice calm, but laced with lethal precision. "Tell me, how exactly did Marcus fund this extravagant Thanksgiving dinner? I froze his black card 3 weeks ago, and his startup is bankrupt." Cora blinked, momentarily confused by the question. "Marcus is a brilliant executive," she replied defensively. "He secured a private short-term loan to ensure we could celebrate properly." I laughed, a cold, sharp sound that echoed off the high ceiling. "He did secure a loan, Cora, but it was not a business loan." I reached into my designer handbag for the second time and pulled out another neatly folded legal document. I slid it down the table until it stopped right in front of her pristine china plate. Marcus did not use his non-existent corporate credit. He used collateral. Specifically, he used the deed to this exact house, the house I paid off for you 2 years ago. Cora stared at the paper, her heavily manicured hands trembling as she picked it up. "What are you talking about?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I never authorized a mortgage on my home. I own this property free and clear." "You did not authorize it," I confirmed, keeping my eyes locked on her horrified face. "Marcus forged your signature on the loan documents. He desperately needed cash to maintain the illusion of his wealth, to pay for this ridiculous dinner, and to keep Vanessa quiet. He mortgaged your entire future to fund his lies. If he defaults on that high-interest loan, which he absolutely will, since he is entirely broke, the bank will foreclose on this property in less than 30 days. You will be homeless before Christmas." Chaos erupted at the Thanksgiving table. Cora unleashed a scream, lunging toward her golden child, with her fingernails bared. Marcus threw his hands up to protect his face in sheer panic, knocking the carving knife onto the expensive hardwood floor with a loud metallic clatter. Heather began sobbing hysterically, screaming at the top of her lungs about her ruined bakery and her completely ruined life. The church deacons scrambled awkwardly out of their chairs, desperately trying to pull the furious thrashing matriarch off her deceitful son before blood was drawn. The illusion of the perfect Sterling family was literally burning to the ground right in front of my eyes. I stood up smoothly picking up my burgundy trench coat, fully intending to leave them to their well-deserved destruction. Suddenly, a deafening, explosive crash echoed through the entire house. The heavy custom-built oak front door was violently kicked open from the outside, splintering the wooden frame into dozens of jagged pieces. The screaming at the table ceased, instantly replaced by a suffocating, terrified silence. It was not the local police arriving to restore order. It was a massive, heavily tattooed man, wearing a leather jacket flanked by two equally intimidating thugs, holding thick wooden bats. How was the incredibly dangerous underground loan shark that Vanessa was actually pregnant by, and he was aggressively looking for Marcus to collect his stolen $200,000. The flickering fluorescent lights of the downtown police precinct illuminated the cold concrete floor where Marcus sat shivering in a holding cell. The chaotic aftermath of the Thanksgiving dinner played on a continuous loop in his mind. The terrifying loan shark had nearly beaten him to death in his mother's formal dining room before local authorities swarmed the property. However, the police had not arrived to save Marcus from a brutal assault. They arrived with a federal warrant for his immediate arrest. The bank managing Cora's mortgage had flagged the fraudulent loan documents, detecting the blatant forgery of his mother's signature. Now stripped of his designer suit and wearing a scratchy, bright orange jumpsuit, the former executive was staring blankly at the iron bars separating him from his freedom. He clutched the single thin blanket the guards had provided, desperately convincing himself that this was merely a temporary setback. He used his one phone call to contact Vanessa, fully expecting his devoted pregnant girlfriend to rush down and post his bail. He was absolutely certain she would empty her own emergency savings accounts to rescue the father of her unborn child. The heavy steel door at the end of the long corridor groaned loudly as it swung open, and an exhausted police officer escorted a woman toward the visitation glass. Marcus leaped up from the hard metal bench, a wave of profound relief washing over his tense features as Vanessa approached the reinforced partition. She looked stunningly immaculate, wearing a sleek black cashmere coat that he had purchased for her just last month, and her makeup was perfectly applied. She did not look like a frantic woman desperate to save her wrongly accused partner. She looked calculating, cold, and entirely purposeful. Marcus grabbed the black plastic telephone receiver mounted on the concrete wall, pressing his face eagerly against the smudged glass. "Vanessa, thank God you are finally here." Marcus breathed into the receiver, his voice trembling with sheer desperation. "You need to post my bail immediately. The judge set the bond at $50,000, and my accounts are completely frozen by that vindictive monster I married. Just wire the money from your savings, and I will pay you back the second I regain control of my startup. We have to get out of this city and protect our baby." Vanessa stared back at him through the scratched glass. Her pale blue eyes completely devoid of the manufactured warmth she usually weaponized to manipulate him. She did not reach out to touch the glass. She did not offer a single word of comfort. Instead, she smoothly reached into her expensive designer handbag and slid a hastily drafted legal contract through the narrow metal slot at the bottom of the partition. "I am not here to bail you out of jail, Marcus," Vanessa stated, her voice flat, sharp, and brutally transactional. "I am here to collect what you owe me. My actual boyfriend, the man who kicked down your mother's front door yesterday, is losing his patience. He wants his $200,000 right now, and since you are completely broke, this is the only valuable asset you have left." Marcus stared down at the paper, his heart dropping into his stomach. "What is this?" he choked out, completely bewildered. "It is a binding transfer of ownership," Vanessa replied coldly. "You are going to sign over your remaining 50% equity in your tech startup directly to me. I will sell those shares to a private buyer tomorrow morning to pay off the debt you incurred when you tried to play the role of a rich executive. Sign it right now, Marcus, or I will let him handle the collection process when you eventually get transferred to the state penitentiary. He has very dangerous friends on the inside who would love to collect a debt on his behalf." Marcus stumbled backward, the phone slipping slightly from his sweaty grip. The horrifying reality of his situation crashed down upon him, suffocating his last remaining shred of arrogant hope. The fragile, innocent woman he had sacrificed his entire marriage to protect was nothing more than a ruthless, opportunistic parasite. Before he could even formulate a desperate plea, the heavy steel door at the end of the corridor swung open for a second time. The rhythmic, commanding click of expensive designer heels echoed sharply against the cold concrete floor, sending an immediate terrifying chill straight down his spine. Simone walked into the grim visitation area looking like absolute royalty. She wore a tailored, pristine white pantsuit that contrasted sharply with the bleak, dirty surroundings of the police precinct. Two highly imposing corporate attorneys in immaculate dark suits walked closely behind her carrying thick leather briefcases. She did not look at Marcus. She walked directly up to Vanessa, who immediately stiffened, clutching her designer handbag defensively against her chest. "You are wasting your time trying to extort equity from a bankrupt man, Vanessa," Simone announced, her voice ringing out with a lethal, effortless authority that commanded the entire room. "His tech startup has absolutely zero market value. The corporate debt I purchased completely eclipses any theoretical equity he holds. You could sell his remaining shares 100 times over, and it still would not cover a fraction of the $200,000 you owe your violent boyfriend." Vanessa sneered, crossing her arms defensively. "This is none of your business, Simone. You already destroyed his life. Go back to your shiny corporate office and leave us alone. I will get my money one way or another." Simone smiled, radiating absolute power. She signaled her attorney, who slid a stamped portfolio through the slot, handing an identical copy to Vanessa. "It is my business," Simone stated smoothly. "I did not come to bail out Marcus. I visited your dangerous loan shark boyfriend. I bailed him out instead and legally purchased your debt portfolio. You no longer owe him a penny, Vanessa. You officially owe me." The heavy oak doors of the family court district closed with a resounding thud, sealing us inside the sterile wood-paneled room where the legal remnants of my marriage would finally be dismantled. Despite facing federal fraud charges and spending 3 miserable nights in a county holding cell before his mother scraped together a bondsman fee, Marcus strutted into the courtroom with a familiar swagger. He wore a wrinkled charcoal suit, clearly trying to project the image of a wrongfully persecuted tech visionary rather than a bankrupt fraudster. He took his seat at the petitioner table, refusing to make eye contact with me, but his posture radiated unearned confidence. He genuinely believed that the family court system was his ultimate salvation. In his narcissistic mind, the state's marital property laws were an impenetrable shield that would force me to surrender half of my empire to fund his legal defense and his pathetic new life. His high-priced divorce attorney, Richard Vance, stood up the moment the judge called the hearing to order. Richard adjusted his silk tie and launched into a practiced monologue designed to paint Marcus as a devoted partner who had been suddenly and maliciously financially cut off by an erratic, tyrannical spouse. "Your Honor, my client is the victim of a calculated hostile corporate takeover masked as a marital dispute," Richard announced, his voice echoing loudly across the silent courtroom. For 5 years, Marcus Sterling supported his wife while she supposedly ran a minor, struggling local delivery fleet. He paid the household bills. He maintained their suburban property. He provided the stability that allowed her to secretly build Vanguard logistics and commercial real estate right under his nose. Because this billion-dollar corporate entity was founded, developed, and expanded entirely during the legal duration of their marriage, it is undisputedly classified as community marital property under state law. Therefore, we are formally demanding an immediate 50% equitable division of all Vanguard assets, full ownership of the primary suburban residence, and permanent monthly spousal support to maintain the standard of living my client has grown accustomed to. Marcus nodded solemnly, along with his lawyer's ridiculous demands, actually managing to look like a wounded, supportive husband who had been cruelly deceived. He folded his hands neatly on the table, a smug, triumphant smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. He thought he had me completely trapped in a legal corner. I sat perfectly still, my expression carved from absolute ice. I wore a tailored ivory pantsuit that contrasted sharply with the dark mahogany of the defendant table, projecting an aura of untouchable, quiet power. I did not roll my eyes at their delusional entitlement. I did not interrupt their pathetic greed-fueled performance. I simply turned my head and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to my lead attorney, David Harrison. David was a legal shark who had never lost a high-stakes corporate divorce in his entire 30-year career. He calmly stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, and picked up a single slender manila envelope from our table. He did not shout or resort to cheap theatrical gestures. He possessed the lethal quiet confidence of a man holding a royal flush. Your Honor, opposing counsel has delivered a very passionate speech regarding standard community property laws. David began smoothly, walking toward the center of the room. However, his entire argument is built on a fundamentally flawed premise. The state's default marital property statutes do not apply to this specific union. Vanguard Logistics is not and never has been subject to equitable division. Richard scoffed loudly from his table. Unless my client's wife possesses a time machine, she built that company while legally married to my client. State law is incredibly clear on this matter. David smiled, a predatory gleam in his dark eyes as he approached the judge's bench. State law is indeed clear, which is exactly why my client took the necessary legal precautions a decade ago. Your Honor, I am submitting into evidence the original fully executed and legally binding prenuptial agreement signed by both parties 10 years ago prior to their marriage. Marcus shot out of his chair, his face contorting in sudden confusion. A prenuptial agreement? That is a complete lie. We never negotiated a prenuptial agreement. Simone was completely broke when we got married. She was just a struggling college graduate with a mountain of student debt. I was the one who had money. I was the one launching a tech startup. I would never sign a document protecting her non-existent assets. You did sign it, Marcus. I finally spoke, my voice slicing through the heavy courtroom air like a freshly sharpened blade. You signed a massive stack of legal documents the week before our wedding. You were incredibly arrogant, entirely convinced of your own superior intellect and my supposed poverty, that you never even bothered to read the paperwork my lawyers handed you. You assumed you were protecting your own pathetic little startup from me. Marcus stared at me, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly, as the horrifying reality of his own blinding arrogance crashed down upon his shoulders. He had blindly signed away his entire future because he underestimated the intelligence of the black woman standing beside him. David opened the envelope and extracted the pristine document. Section 4, paragraph 12 of this legally binding agreement clearly stipulates that any corporate entity founded by Simone remains her sole separate property. Furthermore, Your Honor, I direct your attention to the medical abandonment and infidelity clause. Because the petitioner abandoned my client during a life-threatening high-risk surgical procedure to engage in documented infidelity with a former lover, a fact proven by the hospital logs and hotel receipts already submitted into evidence, he triggers a severe punitive penalty. Marcus Sterling legally forfeits all claims to any shared marital assets, loses all rights to alimony, and currently owes my client $5 million in contractual damages for severe medical endangerment. The crushing legal defeat of my ex-husband was merely the opening act of my overall cleansing process. Marcus was left completely destitute, entirely stripped of the corporate illusions he had weaponized against me for half a decade. However, the parasitic ecosystem that had thrived on my secret labor did not immediately collapse. Heather, my former sister-in-law, refused to accept her absolute eviction from the premium downtown commercial space. Furious over losing her high-end bakery, she decided to deploy the oldest and most dangerous weapon in her specific arsenal. She aggressively played the ultimate fragile white victim to the eager local media. Instead of packing up her baking equipment and quietly leaving my property, Heather immediately hired a prominent civil rights attorney. She formally filed a massive, highly publicized civil lawsuit against Vanguard Real Estate Holdings. She went on every morning news broadcast, squeezing out perfect, calculated tears while sitting on the plush couches of sympathetic talk show hosts. She completely twisted the narrative, maliciously painting me as an angry, aggressive black billionaire who was ruthlessly destroying an innocent, hardworking small business owner out of pure, unprovoked spite. Her desperate public relations campaign quickly gained dangerous traction. Heather mobilized her elite country club network and heavily leveraged her growing social media following to organize a highly visible citywide boycott against all Vanguard subsidiaries. Picket lines formed outside several of my commercial properties. High-profile clients began calling my executive team, nervously asking about the disturbing discrimination allegations swirling around our corporate brand. Heather was absolutely convinced that her manufactured public outrage would force me into a quiet, extremely lucrative financial settlement just to make the terrible publicity disappear. She fundamentally misunderstood exactly who she was dealing with today. I did not build a billion-dollar logistics empire by bowing to pathetic extortionists. I certainly was not going to be intimidated by a highly privileged woman who could not even afford her own commercial rent payments. I absolutely did not offer a private settlement. I instructed my elite public relations team to call a massive live broadcast press conference directly in the main lobby of Vanguard headquarters. I extended a very specific personal invitation to Heather and her high-profile attorney, promising full transparency regarding the eviction dispute. On the morning of the press conference, the expansive marble lobby was absolutely packed with local and national news crews. Bright camera flashes illuminated the room as eager reporters jostled for the best possible broadcasting angle. Heather arrived wearing a modest, incredibly plain beige dress, deliberately attempting to look like a financially devastated humble baker. She sat squarely in the front row, right next to her smug attorney, completely ready to accept my public apology and collect her unearned millions. I walked to the podium, wearing a flawlessly tailored crimson suit projecting absolute, unshackable authority. I looked directly down at Heather, who offered me a pathetic, patronizing smile for the flashing cameras. "Good morning," I announced, my clear voice echoing loudly through the state-of-the-art sound system. Recently, extremely serious allegations of racial discrimination and wrongful eviction have been leveled against Vanguard Real Estate Holdings by a former commercial tenant. We take all accusations of discrimination incredibly seriously. Therefore, instead of offering a standard corporate response, I prefer to let the former tenant's own actions entirely speak for themselves. I did not wait for the reporters to shout their rapid-fire questions. I simply raised my right hand and snapped my fingers. The bright overhead lobby lights dimmed instantly. The massive digital display screen mounted behind my podium flickered to life, commanding the absolute attention of every single person in the crowded room. The high-definition video did not show a victimized small business owner. It showed crisp, crystal-clear security footage from inside the Vanguard corporate offices, perfectly synced with high-quality audio recordings from internal corporate voicemails. The compilation started playing, immediately broadcasting Heather's true character to the entire watching world. In the first audio clip, Heather's shrill, unmistakable voice echoed through the lobby speakers as she left a drunken voicemail for Marcus. "I cannot believe you are letting that stupid, aggressive black woman dictate our family finances, Marcus," she slurred maliciously. "You need to take more of her dirty money to cover my new baking equipment. She is just a delivery driver. It is our absolute right to exploit her." The screen flashed to internal security footage from her bakery's loading dock. Heather was standing there screaming violently at a black delivery driver, repeatedly calling him vile, unforgivable racial slurs simply because he parked his truck an inch too far from the curb. The pristine audio captured every single hateful, bigoted word she shrieked. The final clip was the most legally devastating. It was discussing the financing of the bakery. "I know Marcus stole the initial capital from Simone's corporate accounts to pay my lease." Heather laughed brightly on the video. "But who cares? We deserve that money far more than she does. If she ever tries to evict me, I will just cry to the local media and claim she is a racist. The news anchors will believe my tears over her facts any day of the week." The Vanguard lobby was engulfed in a stunned, deafening silence. Every single camera lens slowly pivoted away from my podium and aimed directly at the front row. Heather sat completely frozen in her chair, her face drained of all color, looking like a woman who had just stepped onto a live landmine. Her high-profile attorney stared at the blank screen in absolute horror. He slowly stood up, forcefully snapped his incredibly expensive leather briefcase shut and glared down at the trembling Heather with a look of pure disgust. "Do not ever contact my law firm again," he stated loudly, turning his back to the cameras and walking swiftly out of the corporate building on live television. With Heather, utterly humiliated, and her malicious lawsuit publicly destroyed the parasitic ecosystem surrounding my former marriage, began its final inevitable collapse. The media quickly lost interest in a disgraced baker, turning their attention to the looming federal fraud case against my ex-husband. But while Marcus awaited his criminal trial in a cheap motel, his mother was facing a devastating reckoning of her own. The massive, high-interest loan Marcus had secured by blatantly forging Cora's signature had officially defaulted. After 90 days of completely ignored payment notices, the bank formally initiated foreclosure proceedings on the sprawling 5-bedroom suburban sanctuary I had originally paid off for her 2 years ago. Cora received her final eviction notice on a cold Tuesday morning. Her entire identity was completely tied to that massive house. It was her ultimate status symbol, the physical manifestation of her unearned superiority within her church community. The terrifying reality of impending homelessness finally shattered her arrogant delusion. With her golden child facing federal prison and her entitled daughter-in-law entirely disgraced, Cora had absolutely no one left to exploit. No one except the black woman she had spent half a decade treating with pure contempt. Late Thursday evening, I was reviewing international logistics contracts in my downtown penthouse when the security concierge called my private line. Cora was standing in the luxury lobby aggressively demanding to be led up to my residence. She was causing a massive scene, weaponizing her age and crying hysterically to the uncomfortable staff. Knowing she would absolutely not leave without a confrontation, I authorized security to escort her up to my private floor. When the polished elevator doors slid open, Cora stepped directly into my expansive living room. She did not march in with her usual overbearing matriarchal arrogance. She looked incredibly frail, wearing an outdated trench coat, her eyes red and heavily swollen. She immediately attempted to close the distance between us, reaching out her shaking hands, as if we were a close, loving family. I took a deliberate step backward, keeping the heavy glass coffee table firmly between us. "Simone, please," Cora sobbed, the tears flowing freely down her lined face. "You have to stop this absolute madness. The bank is legally seizing my house tomorrow morning. They are putting my beautiful home on the public auction block. They are threatening to drag all of my antique furniture and personal memories out onto the front lawn like common garbage. You cannot possibly let your own mother-in-law be thrown out onto the cold streets. We are black women, Simone. We have to look out for our own community. It is your fundamental duty to protect your elders. I am the grandmother of your beautiful triplets. You cannot let the mother of your former husband suffer like this. You have billions of dollars sitting in your corporate accounts. Paying off this fraudulent mortgage is basically pocket change to you. Just write the check and save my home." I looked at the woman who had happily eaten Thanksgiving dinner funded by my stolen money. "You did not care about my grace when you actively helped Marcus hide his infidelities." I stated, my voice completely stripped of any warmth or sympathy. "You did not care about community when you showed up at my corporate office demanding I bail out a man who abandoned my children to die in a hospital. You invoke the concept of the black tax only when it financially benefits your lavish lifestyle. You want me to carry the heavy burden of your son's criminal mistakes simply because I am successful. I am utterly breaking that toxic generational curse today. You allowed Marcus to forge your signature because you loved the luxurious lifestyle his lies provided. You willfully ignored every single warning sign because the expensive gifts and luxurious vacations kept you incredibly comfortable. I will not pay a single penny to rescue you from the direct consequences of your own blinding greed." I instructed my security detail to escort her back to the elevator. Cora screamed curses at me as the doors slid shut. The following morning, the county courthouse steps were bustling with ruthless real estate investors and aggressive property flippers. Cora stood shivering near the cold stone pillars, clutching her worn handbag against her chest. She had desperately shown up to the public foreclosure auction with a pathetic, delusional plan. She intended to identify the winning bidder and beg them for mercy, hoping to convince a stranger to let her rent her foreclosed mansion for a fraction of its actual market value. The auctioneer rapidly read through the legal property descriptions. When Cora's address was finally called, the bidding started low but escalated quickly. The aggressive investors shouted their numbers, driving the price higher and higher until only one anonymous telephone bidder remained. The auctioneer slammed his heavy wooden gavel down, officially declaring the property sold to a private corporate trust. Cora frantically approached the auction coordinator, tears streaming down her face, begging to know the identity of the trust so she could plead her desperate case. Before the annoyed coordinator could even answer her, a sleek jet-black Maybach pulled smoothly up to the curb directly in front of the courthouse steps. A uniformed driver quickly stepped out and opened the heavy rear door. Cora gasped aloud, her trembling hands flying up to cover her mouth. I stepped out of the luxurious vehicle wearing a flawless camel-colored coat, holding the freshly signed certified property deed in my manicured hand. I did not buy the house to save her. I looked directly into Cora's terrified eyes and handed the legal deed to a woman standing beside me. She was the director of a prominent local charity dedicated to providing safe transitional housing for displaced hardworking Black mothers. "The property is completely yours," I announced clearly. The courthouse security guards gently but firmly grabbed Cora by the arms, officially escorting her off the premises. Watching Cora, being physically removed from the courthouse steps, provided a profound sense of closure, but my schedule did not allow for lingering sentimentality. I slid into the leather seat of my Maybach and instructed my driver to take me directly to the Vanguard Logistics headquarters. The complete financial annihilation of my former mother-in-law was a necessary boundary, but it was still merely a prelude to the evening's main event. Tonight was the Vanguard Annual Charity Gala, a highly exclusive philanthropic gathering designed to raise millions for inner-city youth programs. While Marcus was currently rotting in a cheap rundown motel on the outskirts of the city, awaiting his inevitable federal fraud trial, with absolutely zero corporate assets to his name, I was preparing to host the most prestigious social event of the entire season. I spent the late afternoon in my executive suite, finalizing the guest list and ensuring our security protocols were absolutely flawless. My security chief, David, had already flagged a potential perimeter breach, but I explicitly instructed him to let the desperate intruder slip through our exterior checkpoints. I knew exactly who was coming for me, and I wanted to welcome her properly. The grand ballroom of the Sinclair Hotel was completely transformed into a breathtaking vision of modern elegance. Towering floral arrangements of white orchids and deep red roses decorated every single table, while the soft ambient lighting reflected perfectly off the crystal chandeliers. I descended the sweeping grand staircase, wearing a custom floor-length sapphire gown that projected absolute unapologetic power. The city's most elite power brokers, corporate executives, and philanthropic leaders immediately gravitated toward me, offering their eager congratulations on Vanguard's unprecedented quarterly earnings. I navigated the crowded room with practiced grace, shaking hands and securing massive charitable donations with nothing more than a polite smile and a firm handshake. Despite the overwhelming success of the evening, my dark eyes constantly scanned the perimeter of the ballroom, waiting patiently for the inevitable arrival of the parasite who still thought she could outsmart me. I politely excused myself from a lengthy conversation with a prominent state senator and walked purposefully toward the secluded, dimly lit VIP lounge near the back of the venue. The heavy velvet curtains provided the perfect acoustic dampening for private conversations. Just as I reached for the polished brass handle, a frantic hand grabbed my arm. I did not flinch or pull away. I simply turned my head slowly to look down at Vanessa. She looked absolutely wretched. The glamorous, arrogant facade she had weaponized against me in the hospital and the courtroom was completely gone. Her cheap, off-the-rack dress was wrinkled, her blonde hair was messy, and her pale blue eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated panic. She released my arm instantly when she saw the freezing, lethal expression on my face, but she blocked the narrow hallway with her trembling body. "We need to talk right now, Simone," Vanessa hissed, her voice shaking violently as she frantically checked the empty hallway for passing security guards. Marcus is completely broke and he is absolutely useless to me now. My boyfriend is furious about the corporate debt you bought. He owes very dangerous people a lot of money, and if I do not pay him off by midnight, he is going to put me in the hospital. I looked at her with pure, unfiltered disgust. Your terrible choices in violent, criminal men are not my financial responsibility, Vanessa. You proudly helped Marcus destroy our marriage, and now you are experiencing the exact life you actively chose to build. Step aside before I have you arrested for trespassing at a private corporate event. Vanessa refused to move, stepping closer and lowering her voice into a desperate, malicious whisper. I am not asking for a favor, Simone. I am making a business transaction. I know you care deeply about your flawless public image and your precious triplets. If you do not wire $500,000 into my offshore account, right this second, I am going immediately to the tabloid press waiting outside this hotel. I will tell every single reporter that Marcus is actually the biological father of your 3 children. I will fabricate a massive, scandalous story claiming you used your corporate wealth to falsify his medical records just to maliciously cut him out of their lives. It will trigger a massive media circus, a brutal public paternity battle, and it will permanently destroy your flawless reputation. I did not gasp, and I certainly did not panic. I simply threw my head back and let out a sharp, genuinely amused laugh that echoed loudly in the quiet corridor. Vanessa blinked in absolute confusion, stepping back as a tall, broad-shouldered man in a pristine tuxedo stepped out from the shadows of the VIP lounge. Vanessa, I said smoothly, gesturing toward the imposing man standing right beside me. You have been so focused on my money that you completely failed to notice my esteemed gala guest. I would love to formally introduce you to Special Agent Thomas Carter from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Vanessa's jaw dropped, her face turning an incredibly sickly shade of gray as the federal agent reached into his tailored tuxedo jacket and calmly pulled out his gleaming golden badge. Agent Carter has been quietly building a massive racketeering and organized crime case against your dangerous loan shark boyfriend for the past 8 continuous months. I explained smoothly, leaning in close so she could clearly hear every single lethal syllable. We fully knew you would immediately resort to criminal blackmail the very second your stolen money inevitably ran out. That beautiful sparkling diamond necklace you are currently staring at resting flawlessly on my collarbone actually contains a highly sensitive federal broadcasting microphone. Your absolutely pathetic, desperate extortion attempt was just recorded perfectly on a live, heavily monitored federal wire. You are officially under arrest, Vanessa. Enjoy rotting in prison while I raise them. Watching federal agents securely handcuff Vanessa and escort her out the back exit of the Sinclair Hotel ballroom was a profoundly satisfying conclusion to my evening. She wept hysterically, begging for a second chance, but I simply turned my back and took a slow, victorious sip of my sparkling champagne. The malicious parasites who had gleefully attempted to feast on my pain were finally facing the severe, irreversible consequences of their own actions. However, my strategic cleansing was not entirely complete. I still had one final fatal blow to deliver to the architect of my suffering. Marcus was currently out on bail, utterly humiliated and stripped of his stolen personal wealth, but he still desperately clung to his fabricated corporate identity. He genuinely believed that his failing tech startup was his ultimate salvation. He was absolutely convinced that he could manipulate his way back into the elite circles of the city. I was going to systematically dismantle that delusion right in front of his board of directors. The very next morning, the atmosphere inside the sleek, modern headquarters of Marcus's tech startup was incredibly tense. The company was aggressively bleeding capital, facing imminent bankruptcy due to months of Marcus's gross financial mismanagement and his illegal diversion of corporate funds. His exhausted, furious board of directors sat around the massive glass conference table demanding immediate answers. Marcus stood at the head of the table wearing a cheap, off-the-rack suit that sharply contrasted with his usual designer wardrobe. Despite his pathetic circumstances, he still possessed that infuriating, unearned arrogance. He leaned forward, resting his hands confidently on the polished glass, projecting the false bravado of a man who believed he was the smartest person in the room. Gentlemen, I understand your deep concerns regarding our current fiscal quarter, Marcus announced, his voice smooth and practiced. We have experienced some unexpected hurdles. My vindictive soon-to-be ex-wife maliciously froze my personal assets and attempted to sabotage my reputation out of pure, unprovoked jealousy. But my professional genius remains completely untouched. I have successfully navigated us out of this temporary rough patch. I have secured a massive, life-saving capital injection from Apex Global, a highly prestigious anonymous investment group based in Dubai. They recognize my visionary leadership. They have agreed to purchase 60% of our available shares, injecting enough liquid cash to completely save this company. Furthermore, their primary condition for this generous buyout is that I remain firmly seated as the Chief Executive Officer to guide our next phase of explosive growth. The board members exchanged highly skeptical glances, muttering quietly among themselves. They were desperate for a financial miracle, but Marcus had lied to them far too many times before. The oldest board member, a stern man named Richard, tapped his pen aggressively against his notepad. We need to see the actual documentation, Marcus, Richard demanded loudly. We are hours away from filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. If this foreign investor is real, we need them to verify the capital transfer immediately. We will not authorize the sale of controlling shares based on your empty promises. Marcus smirked, gesturing grandly toward the massive digital display screen mounted on the far wall of the conference room. You do not have to take my word for it, Richard. The lead representative from Apex Global is joining us via video conference right now to finalize the paperwork and transfer the funds. Prepare to be amazed by my success. He pressed a button on his remote control. The large screen flickered, displaying the loading icon for a secure corporate video call. The board members leaned in closely, holding their collective breath as the digital connection stabilized. The screen illuminated, broadcasting a crystal-clear, high-definition video feed. Marcus turned around, a triumphant smile plastered across his face, ready to welcome his savior. His smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. It was not an anonymous investment banker from Dubai on the screen. It was me. I was sitting in my luxurious Vanguard penthouse office, wearing a flawless emerald green suit and the diamond necklace I had worn to the gala. I offered the stunned conference room a cold, predatory smile. Good morning, gentlemen, I stated, my clear voice echoing loudly through the state-of-the-art sound system. I am the sole founder and chief executive officer of Vanguard Logistics. I am also the primary undisclosed backer behind the Apex Global Shell Corporation. It is an absolute pleasure to finally meet the board of directors my husband has been systematically defrauding for the past 12 months. Marcus stumbled backward, his knees slamming hard against his chair. Simone, he choked out, his face draining of all color. This is completely impossible. You cannot be the investor. You do not have the clearance to purchase those shares. I have the clearance, the capital, and the signed contracts, Marcus, I replied smoothly, holding up the thick, legally binding acquisition agreement. I purchased 60% of your controlling shares for pennies on the dollar. Blinded by your desperate need for validation, you gladly signed over the company to a foreign entity without conducting a single background check. The board members erupted into chaotic shouting, realizing they had been acquired by their disgraced CEO's wealthy wife. Marcus clutched his chest, struggling to breathe as his final delusion closed in around him. As the new absolute majority shareholder of this entire corporation, I am executing my immediate executive rights, I announced, raising my voice to silence the panicked room. I am dissolving this board of directors effective this very second. I am initiating the immediate liquidation of all remaining corporate assets to recover the debts owed to Vanguard. And finally, Marcus, your employment is officially terminated with cause. You are permanently stripped of your corporate title, denied any financial severance package whatsoever, and my security team is waiting outside that glass door to manually escort you out of my building right now. Marcus stumbled backward as two massive security guards materialized from the hallway, their hands gripping his arms with absolute bruising authority. He tried to shout something, a final desperate threat, but the heavy glass doors swung shut, cutting off his pathetic voice completely. The boardroom sat in stunned silence. The remaining executives stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, entirely aware that their corporate survival now rested squarely in the palm of my hand. I calmly closed my laptop, severing the video connection, and leaned back in my leather chair. The absolute destruction of my ex-husband was finally complete. However, the sprawling toxic roots of his deceit extended much further than his own personal bank accounts. The financial earthquake I had just unleashed was rapidly triggering a massive tsunami that was about to drown the rest of his enabling family. Darren Marcus's older brother and Heather's supposedly oblivious husband had spent his entire adult life hiding behind a veil of convenient ignorance. He enjoyed the luxurious vacations, the expensive cars, and the lavish country club lifestyle, never questioning how his brother's failing startup or his wife's non-existent bakery profits managed to fund it all. But ignorance is a luxury that instantly expires the moment federal agents start asking questions. Following the catastrophic public exposure of Heather's racist tirade and Marcus's initial arrest for real estate fraud, Darren finally panicked. He was not a criminal mastermind. He was simply a lazy beneficiary of their systemic theft. Terrified that the looming federal racketeering charges would sweep him up as a primary accessory, he desperately broke into his wife's private home office. What he discovered hidden inside Heather's locked filing cabinet completely shattered his comfortable delusion. He found detailed, highly encrypted bank statements proving that Heather and Marcus had been operating a joint financial grift for over 3 years. Marcus had systematically funneled stolen corporate funds from my accounts into the startup, and Heather had actively laundered that stolen money through her bakery's payroll system. But the most devastating revelation for Darren was not the theft itself. It was the destination of the funds. Heather had not used the money to pay their shared household mortgage or fund their joint retirement. She had secretly transferred nearly $800,000 into a private offshore shell account located in the Cayman Islands. She had been quietly preparing a massive financial escape hatch, fully intending to abandon Darren the moment the fraud was inevitably exposed. Facing absolute financial ruin and decades in a federal penitentiary for crimes he did not even profit from, Darren realized he had only one viable option left. He could not rely on his mother Cora, who was currently living in a cheap motel after her public eviction. He certainly could not rely on his brother, who was now unemployed, disgraced, and facing his own severe criminal indictment. He had to beg the very woman his entire family had spent years aggressively abusing. Late Thursday afternoon, my executive assistant buzzed my private office line. She informed me that Darren was pacing frantically in the Vanguard Logistics lobby, begging for just 5 minutes of my time. I smiled, savoring the delicious irony of a man who had repeatedly mocked my delivery business now standing in my lobby, desperately praying for my mercy. I authorized his entry and waited behind my massive desk. Darren practically sprinted into my office the second the elevator doors opened. His usually perfectly styled hair was a disheveled mess, and dark, heavy bags hung under his bloodshot eyes. He was sweating profusely, clutching a small silver external hard drive tightly against his chest, like a physical shield. He did not possess his usual arrogant swagger. He looked like a cornered animal realizing the trap had just snapped shut. "Simone, please, you have to listen to me," Darren pleaded, his voice cracking with genuine, unadulterated fear. He collapsed heavily into one of the leather guest chairs, dropping his face into his trembling hands. "I swear to you on my life, I had absolutely no idea what they were doing to you. I thought Marcus was a successful tech genius. I thought Heather's bakery was actually turning a massive profit. I never knew they were systematically stealing your corporate funds to pay for our lifestyle. You have to believe me, I am entirely innocent." I leaned back in my chair, steepling my manicured fingers together. "Innocence implies a lack of participation, Darren," I stated, my voice completely devoid of any sympathy. "You happily drank the expensive wine bought with my stolen money. You drove the luxury cars financed by my secret labor. You sat at Thanksgiving dinner and laughed while your wife insulted my character. You were perfectly content to reap the rich rewards of their crimes until the federal authorities started knocking on your front door. You are not an innocent victim. You are just a parasite who suddenly realized the host is dead. Darren flinched visibly, tears of pure desperation welling up in his eyes. I know I was a fool, he sobbed, his voice rising to a pathetic high-pitched whine. But Heather betrayed me too. She set up secret offshore accounts. She was actively planning to take the stolen money and disappear, leaving me to face the prosecutors alone. I am facing 20 years in prison. Please, Simone. I will do whatever you want. I only make strategic business transactions, I said coldly. You are holding an encrypted hard drive. I assume it proves exactly how they laundered my corporate funds through her bakery. Darren nodded frantically, holding the device out toward me. It has everything. Every account number, every fake invoice, every forged signature. I will grant you a clean slate, I announced. But in exchange, you are sending your own wife and brother to the district attorney. He paused, took a breath, looked down, then handed the hard drive over to me, without uttering another single pathetic, meaningless word of regret or sorrow. Darren turned on his heel and practically fled my corporate office, leaving behind the digital key that would permanently dismantle the last remnants of his brother's fraudulent empire. I securely locked the silver hard drive in my personal safe, knowing the federal prosecutors would be thrilled to receive my anonymous care package in the morning. However, my ex-husband still had one final agonizingly predictable card left to play. Cornered, bankrupt, and facing imminent indictment, Marcus resorted to the most manipulative tactic available to a desperate narcissist. He weaponized our children. Just 3 days before his federal arraignment, my legal team received a frantic emergency filing from a discount family law attorney Marcus had somehow scrounged up. The audacity of the petition was staggering. Marcus was formally filing for sole physical and legal custody of my infant triplets, aggressively petitioning the family court to label me an unfit absentee mother. He ridiculously claimed that my demanding position as the chief executive officer of Vanguard Logistics completely compromised my ability to provide a safe, nurturing environment for vulnerable infants. He was trying to use my children as a biological anchor, hoping a sympathetic judge would grant him custody and, by extension, force me to pay him astronomical monthly child support. The family court hearing was scheduled, swiftly reflecting the supposed urgency of infants allegedly in danger. I arrived at the courthouse wearing a flawlessly tailored plum suit, projecting the absolute unshakable calm of a mother who knew exactly how to protect her offspring. Marcus sat at the petitioner's table, attempting to look like a deeply concerned, highly responsible father. He had even combed his hair conservatively and wore a modest sweater, a stark departure from his usual flashy designer suits. His discount lawyer stood up and launched into a practiced, highly dramatic narrative. He painted Marcus as a devoted, loving family man who simply wanted to rescue his innocent babies from a cold, ruthlessly ambitious corporate titan who cared more about profit margins than midnight feedings. To bolster this entirely fabricated illusion, Marcus had brought his ultimate enabler to the witness stand. Cora, fresh from her humiliating eviction and currently living in a cheap rental, swore under oath to tell the absolute truth. She immediately launched into a theatrical, tearful performance. She boldly claimed to the judge that Marcus had spent months meticulously preparing the suburban nursery, that he possessed an innate, powerful paternal instinct, and that I was completely emotionally detached from the pregnancy. Cora aggressively testified that I had purposefully locked a loving, desperate father out of his own children's lives, purely out of bitter, petty spite regarding a minor financial disagreement. She clutched a crumpled tissue, begging the judge to give her sweet, responsible son his rightful babies. I did not react to her blatant perjury. I simply glanced at my lead attorney, David Harrison, who stood up with the relaxed, lethal posture of a predator smelling blood in the water. David approached the witness stand carrying a thick stack of certified documents. He did not raise his voice. He did not act aggressively. He simply placed the first document on the wooden ledge directly in front of Cora. Mrs. Sterling, you just testified under penalty of perjury that your son is a deeply devoted, highly attentive father who was maliciously locked out of his children's lives. David stated clearly, his voice carrying effortlessly across the quiet courtroom. Are you absolutely certain about your son's profound paternal dedication? Cora lifted her chin defiantly. I am absolutely certain. My son loves those babies. She is the one keeping him away. David smiled a cold, razor-sharp smile. Your Honor, I would like to submit Exhibit A into evidence. These are the certified time-stamped hospital admission logs and surgical records from Mercy General Hospital, detailing the exact night my client underwent an emergency life-threatening cesarean section to deliver these triplets. David turned his piercing gaze toward Marcus. According to these official hospital records, Marcus Sterling was completely absent during the surgical procedure, absent during the recovery, and absent during the first 3 critical days of his children's lives in the neonatal intensive care unit. Marcus shifted violently in his chair, his face flushing a deep, angry red. His discount lawyer scrambled to object, claiming Marcus had a legitimate medical emergency of his own that night, but David was already holding up the next piece of undeniable evidence. I assure you, Your Honor, the petitioner did not have a medical emergency. David continued smoothly, pulling out a color-printed map displaying glowing red GPS coordinates. Exhibit B is the certified geolocation data pulled directly from the petitioner's smartphone and personal vehicle tracking system. On the exact night his wife was hemorrhaging on an operating table, fighting to save 3 premature infants, the devoted father was located exactly 12 miles away, securely parked at the downtown Platinum Hotel. The judge leaned forward, his expression hardening into a mask of pure, unadulterated disgust. Cora stopped crying, her eyes darting frantically between David and her son. And just in case there is any lingering doubt regarding what the petitioner was doing at that hotel while his children were fighting for their lives in incubators, I present Exhibit C, David announced, dropping a finalized, itemized receipt onto the evidence table. This is a credit card transaction time-stamped at the exact minute my client's heart rate began crashing in the emergency room. Marcus Sterling was happily paying $600 for a custom, 3-tier red velvet birthday cake for his former girlfriend, Vanessa. He explicitly instructed the bakery to deliver it to the hotel penthouse, and he intentionally turned off his cellular device so the hospital could not interrupt his romantic celebration. The heavy, suffocating silence in the courtroom was absolute. Marcus opened his mouth to speak, to offer some pathetic, manipulative excuse, but the sheer weight of his own documented depravity crushed the words right out of his throat. Cora stared at her son in genuine horror, finally realizing that the golden child she had protected her entire life was completely, irredeemably monstrous. The judge did not even bother to hide his profound revulsion. He slammed his wooden gavel down with enough force to echo like a gunshot. This court has heard entirely enough, the judge declared, his voice shaking with furious authority. Marcus Sterling, your behavior demonstrates a catastrophic, malicious level of medical and emotional abandonment. Your petition for custody is not just denied, it is offensive to this court. Due to the severe, documented endangerment of the mother and the complete abandonment of these fragile infants, I am hereby revoking all of your parental rights, effective immediately. Furthermore, I am granting Simone Sterling a permanent ironclad restraining order against you. You will never approach these children again. The definitive, crushing finality of the ruling hit Marcus like a physical blow to the chest. The last remaining string tethering him to my immense wealth was violently severed. He let out a strange, strangled gasp, clutching his hands tightly against his chest, before his eyes rolled completely back in his head. Marcus collapsed heavily onto the hard courtroom floor, completely unconscious, finally succumbing to the absolute destruction of his own making. The heavy thud of Marcus hitting the courtroom floor was a deeply satisfying sound, but my strategic eradication of this parasitic family was not entirely finished. While the court bailiffs literally scraped my disgraced ex-husband off the linoleum, my immediate focus shifted completely toward the other entitled leech who had financed her arrogant existence with my stolen corporate wealth. Heather had spent years weaponizing her fragile white privilege against me, constantly mocking my ambition while secretly funding her luxurious lifestyle through her husband's complicity and Marcus's blatant embezzlement. Thanks to the highly encrypted hard drive, her terrified husband Darren had surrendered to my legal team. The federal prosecutors possessed an absolute mountain of undeniable evidence. Early Tuesday morning, a team of armed federal agents raided Heather's upscale suburban rental property, officially charging her with multiple counts of severe wire fraud, money laundering, and grand theft. Instead of feeling genuine remorse or finally taking accountability for her massive financial crimes, Heather immediately doubled down on her manufactured victimhood. She expertly deployed the exact same manipulative tactics she had utilized during our lobby confrontation. Facing absolute financial ruin and mounting legal fees after Darren filed for an immediate aggressive divorce to protect his own remaining assets, Heather launched a massive, highly publicized crowdfunding campaign on several major social media platforms. She recorded a pathetic, heavily filtered video of herself sitting on a cheap sofa, squeezing out calculated tears while wearing a plain gray sweater. "I am a dedicated, hardworking small business owner who is being ruthlessly targeted by a hostile, incredibly vindictive billionaire." Heather sobbed to the camera, expertly playing the role of the innocent, persecuted woman. "My former sister-in-law is aggressively using her massive corporate wealth to maliciously destroy my life, simply because she is deeply insecure and bitter. I desperately need your financial support to hire a defense attorney and fight this horrific, unfair persecution." Her performative distress unfortunately worked on a specific, highly gullible demographic. Within 48 hours, her fraudulent legal defense fund had accumulated over $50,000 from sympathetic strangers and her remaining wealthy country club associates. She was essentially trying to crowdsource a brand new grift to save herself from the consequences of her original grift. I absolutely refused to allow her to control the public narrative or profit from her racist, manipulative lies ever again. I did not waste my time arguing with her sympathetic supporters in the chaotic comment sections of her pathetic social media posts. Instead, I authorized my elite corporate public relations firm to execute a flawless, utterly devastating counterattack. My team partnered with an award-winning independent production company to rapidly produce a sleek, highly professional, and entirely factual mini-documentary titled "The Parasite Economy." We did not use emotional manipulation or dramatic voiceovers. We simply presented the cold, hard, indisputable financial facts. The high-definition video meticulously traced the exact digital paper trail of my stolen corporate funds. It displayed the official, time-stamped bank transfers moving directly from Vanguard Logistics accounts into Marcus's failing startup and then routing seamlessly into Heather's offshore shell accounts. We prominently featured the devastating security camera footage of Heather screaming vile racial slurs at my black delivery drivers, juxtaposed brilliantly against her tearful, hypocritical crowdfunding plea. We also included a redacted, verified statement from Darren, confirming that his wife had actively planned to steal the laundered money and flee the country. I released the comprehensive documentary across all major streaming platforms and corporate social media channels simultaneously on a Friday morning. The viral explosion was immediate and absolutely catastrophic for Heather. Within 3 hours, the documentary accumulated millions of unique views. The undeniable, thoroughly documented proof of her blatant theft and horrific bigotry completely shattered her fragile victim narrative. The major crowdfunding platform immediately suspended her active campaign, citing severe violations of their terms of service regarding fraudulent legal defense funds, and they automatically refunded every single misallocated dollar back to the original donors. Heather was left entirely isolated, completely bankrupt, and universally despised by the very public she had desperately tried to manipulate. Her federal criminal trial was remarkably swift and completely devoid of any lingering suspense. Without the stolen funds to hire a prestigious defense team, she was forced to rely on an overworked public defender who clearly despised her entitled attitude. The federal judge presiding over the case showed absolutely zero mercy for her blatant financial crimes and her complete lack of genuine remorse. Heather was formally convicted on all major charges. She was sentenced to serve 36 months in a minimum security federal correctional facility, But the financial punishment the judge levied was far more permanent and creatively devastating. She was legally ordered to pay back every single stolen penny in full court-mandated restitution directly to Vanguard Logistics, a massive debt that would aggressively garnish her wages for the rest of her natural life. 3 years later, Heather was officially released from federal prison on early parole, stepping out into a world that had completely moved on without her. Stripped of her luxurious suburban home, her prestigious country club membership, and her wealthy husband, she was forced to desperately seek immediate employment just to satisfy the strict requirements of her demanding parole officer. Because of her severe felony fraud conviction, no reputable corporate office or retail boutique would even consider reviewing her pathetic resume. She was ultimately forced to accept a grueling minimum wage position, working the late-night shift for a large commercial cleaning service. I made absolutely certain that my vast corporate influence guided her direct placement within that specific cleaning company. On her very first night of exhausting manual labor, Heather pushed a heavy plastic janitorial cart filled with cheap bleach and dirty mops out of a service elevator. She looked up and froze in absolute soul-crushing despair. She was standing in the immaculate high-end retail lobby of the exact premium commercial building where her fake bakery once stood. The cold wind of reality hit Cora the moment the courthouse doors slammed shut behind her. The sprawling five-bedroom suburban sanctuary she had proudly lorded over her church congregation was gone, replaced by the concrete of a subsidized housing complex on the far edges of the city. Her new reality was a cramped one-bedroom apartment that smelled of stale smoke and boiled cabbage. There were no vaulted ceilings, no marble countertops, and no spaces to host her stolen Thanksgiving dinners. Her antique furniture had been sold off at a steep discount just to cover her moving expenses and a meager security deposit. She sat on a cheap, sagging mattress, staring blankly at the peeling yellow wallpaper. The oppressive silence of the tiny apartment was deafening. Her country club friends had immediately blocked her phone number the moment the fraud scandal hit the evening news. The church deacons refused to return her desperate calls. She was entirely stripped of her unearned arrogance. However, Cora refused to accept that her days of exploiting my labor were permanently over. She firmly believed that familial obligation was an unbreakable chain. She convinced herself that I was simply throwing an extended petty tantrum. In her twisted mind, she assumed I would inevitably fold under the immense cultural pressure to respect my elders. She decided to deploy the most manipulative weapon remaining in her arsenal. She planned to fabricate a severe medical emergency to force my hand blindly, assuming my conscience would compel me to rush to her bedside with an open checkbook. Late on a freezing Thursday evening, Cora deliberately knocked her plastic telephone off the kitchen counter to make it sound chaotic. She dialed the emergency contact number for Vanguard Logistics, a direct line she had deceitfully memorized from Marcus's old corporate files. My executive assistant answered the call immediately. Cora launched into a spectacular performance. She gasped loudly into the receiver, clutching her chest and crying out in manufactured agony. She wailed that her heart was failing, that the stress of the foreclosure had triggered a massive cardiac event, and she demanded that I be notified to save her life. She cried out that she needed to be transported to the Sinclair Medical Institute, the exact same private hospital where I had delivered my triplets, fully expecting me to cover the exorbitant admission fees. My assistant calmly placed the frantic call on a brief hold and transferred the audio directly to my penthouse office. I listened to the shrill, dramatic weeping echoing through my desktop speakers. I did not feel a single ounce of panic, guilt, or familial obligation. I recognized the manipulative grift instantly. She wanted me to panic rush to her side and fall right back into the suffocating role of the financial savior. Dispatch a standard city ambulance to her subsidized housing address immediately. I instructed my assistant, my voice completely devoid of any warmth or hesitation. Do not contact Sinclair Medical Institute. Let the municipal paramedics transport her to the closest county general hospital. Furthermore, you will contact the hospital billing department the moment she is formally admitted. You will explicitly inform the financial administrators that Vanguard Logistics, Vanguard Real Estate, and Simone Sterling are completely legally and financially detached from the patient. We will absolutely not authorize, guarantee, or pay for a single cent of her medical transport, her emergency room evaluation, or her hospital stay. She is entirely on her own. 30 minutes later, Cora found herself strapped to a hard gurney inside a loud, chaotic municipal ambulance. She was not being rushed to a luxurious private medical suite. She was unceremoniously dumped into the overcrowded, underfunded waiting room of the county hospital. She sat in a stiff plastic chair for 6 agonizing hours, surrounded by the exact same working-class people she had spent decades openly mocking and aggressively looking down upon. When the overworked emergency room doctor finally examined her, he quickly concluded that her heart was functioning perfectly normally. She had essentially suffered a panic attack induced by her own fabricated theatrics. The true medical emergency arrived precisely when the hospital billing administrator handed her the discharge paperwork. Because she lacked premium health insurance, the cost of the emergency municipal ambulance ride, and the extensive unnecessary cardiac evaluation totaled nearly $6,000. The administrator demanded an immediate payment plan. Cora frantically demanded they forward the massive bill directly to my corporate headquarters, loudly boasting about her wealthy daughter-in-law. The administrator offered her a look of profound, tired pity. He informed her that my legal team had already explicitly blocked any financial association. She was trapped with the massive, crippling debt she had intentionally manufactured. Cora slowly trudged back into her miserable, cramped apartment, just as the sun began to rise over the dreary city skyline. She was physically exhausted, financially devastated, and completely spiritually broken. She collapsed onto her cheap mattress and turned on the small static-filled television she had salvaged. The local morning news broadcast was playing loudly. The anchor's voice cut through the stale air of the tiny room, delivering the final fatal blow to her shattered reality. The news anchor announced that federal prosecutors had officially rejected Marcus's desperate plea deal. Because he refused to surrender the hidden offshore accounts, the judge had formally sentenced her beloved golden child to serve 5 hard years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. Cora gasped, fresh, genuine tears finally spilling down her wrinkled cheeks. The screen quickly shifted to the next major news segment. It was a flawless, high-definition broadcast of me standing confidently on a brightly lit stage, accepting a prestigious National Business Award. I looked radiant, incredibly powerful, and completely, utterly untouchable. Cora stared at my smiling face on the screen, the suffocating weight of her irreversible choices finally crushing the last remaining breath from her lungs. She was left entirely alone in the cold dark. While Cora withered away in the suffocating darkness of her subsidized apartment, Marcus was desperately attempting to navigate the devastating wreckage of his own shattered existence. The federal prosecutors had ultimately offered him a brutal, uncompromising plea agreement. He narrowly avoided a lengthy prison sentence, but the crushing terms of the deal completely annihilated his entire fabricated identity. He was legally forced to surrender absolutely every single financial asset, permanently forfeit his corporate executive status, and agree to astronomical lifelong financial restitution. The arrogant, high-flying tech visionary was officially dead, replaced by a broke, disgraced felon living in a dingy, roach-infested motel room on the absolute outskirts of the city. He spent 3 grueling months desperately applying for any mid-level corporate management position he could find, but his highly publicized federal fraud conviction effectively blacklisted him from the entire white-collar business world. His inflated ego slowly starved to death as the mounting pile of unpaid legal bills threatened to send him right back to a jail cell. He had absolutely no other choice but to completely swallow his toxic, unearned pride. He began aggressively scouring the local classified advertisements for basic entry-level manual labor. He eventually submitted a pathetic, stripped-down resume to a local mid-sized freight and delivery service that was urgently hiring independent dispatchers and route drivers. The hiring manager did not care about his disgraced corporate background or his ruined tech startup. They only cared that he possessed a valid driver's license and could pass a basic physical examination. Marcus was hired immediately on a probationary minimum wage basis. He was handed a stiff, uncomfortable brown polyester uniform shirt and assigned to the grueling early morning shift. The profound, sickening irony of his new reality was entirely lost on him. He had spent his entire marriage aggressively mocking my logistics business, constantly belittling the incredibly hard, honest labor of delivery drivers while he sat in air-conditioned boardrooms stealing my money. Now he was sweating in the cramped, non-air-conditioned cab of a rattling box truck, desperately delivering packages just to afford his next cheap meal. On his very first official day on the job, his gruff supervisor handed him a highly sensitive premium delivery route. Marcus was specifically tasked with securely transporting a massive, incredibly fragile, and astronomically expensive custom floral arrangement. The breathtaking display consisted of hundreds of rare imported white orchids and deep crimson roses arranged meticulously in a heavy crystal vase. He was explicitly warned that the wealthy recipient was a highly valued, top-tier client and any damage to the arrangement would result in his immediate termination. He carefully loaded the heavy flowers into the back of his delivery van, his muscles aching with unfamiliar, exhausting physical exertion. He carefully drove the rattling old delivery vehicle straight through the sprawling city limits, eventually turning onto a highly exclusive, heavily guarded private road lined with towering ancient oak trees. He pulled up to a massive, imposing set of wrought iron security gates, protecting a breathtaking, sprawling, modern luxury estate. He nervously spoke his delivery confirmation code into the brass intercom system. The heavy gates swung open smoothly, granting him access to a world he had once falsely claimed to rule. Marcus parked his delivery van at the bottom of a sweeping circular stone driveway. He carefully lifted the massive floral arrangement out of the back, his arms shaking slightly under the immense weight of the crystal vase. He trudged slowly up the wide marble steps, his cheap polyester uniform clinging uncomfortably to his sweating back. He awkwardly balanced the heavy flowers against his hip and pressed the glowing brass doorbell. He fully expected a uniformed housekeeper or an armed, highly trained private security guard to immediately answer the heavy, expensive, custom-built double doors. He heard the distinct sharp click of the internal lock disengaging. The massive wooden doors swung inward on silent, perfectly oiled hinges. Marcus looked up and completely froze, the breath violently expelled from his lungs, as if he had just been physically struck. I stood gracefully in the grand sunlit foyer of my private multi-million-dollar estate. I wore a flawless, flowing silk emerald gown that draped perfectly around my figure, radiating absolute untouchable power and profound peace. My hair was styled immaculately, and the quiet, joyful sounds of my three healthy, thriving babies echoed softly from the sprawling nursery down the hall. I looked directly into the wide, terrified eyes of my completely ruined ex-husband. Marcus stood there completely frozen and trembling in his extremely cheap sweat-stained uniform, holding the massive floral arrangement that my executive board had sent to congratulate me on Vanguard's latest record-breaking quarterly earnings. Simone. Marcus choked out, his voice cracking into a pathetic, fragile whisper as his shaking hands struggled to support the heavy crystal vase. "What are you doing here? How do you live here?" I offered him a cold, serene smile, stepping forward to smoothly accept the beautiful flowers from his trembling grip. "I own the entire estate, Marcus," I stated, my clear voice echoing beautifully in the massive foyer. "Just like Vanguard Logistics officially owns the minor subsidiary delivery service that just hired you yesterday. You are standing on my private property wearing a uniform purchased by my corporate conglomerate, delivering flowers bought with the profits of my empire." Marcus stared at me in absolute soul-crushing horror, completely unable to form a single coherent word as the inescapable, devastating reality of his profound, miserable failure finally washed entirely over his broken spirit. I calmly reached deep into the pocket of my silk gown, extracted a single crumpled $1 bill, and tucked it neatly into the breast pocket of his extremely cheap polyester uniform shirt. "Try not to be late for your next delivery, Marcus," I said softly. "My international company consistently maintains exceptionally high, rigorous standards for all of its entry-level employees, so please drive carefully today." 2 years passed, washing away the bitter ashes of the past, and leaving a foundation built on absolute truth. The grand ballroom of the National Civic Center was completely transformed into a sea of glittering crystal and deep emerald velvet. Tonight, I was not just a survivor of financial abuse or a woman who had successfully escaped a parasitic marriage. Tonight, the National Commerce Coalition was officially honoring me as the Businesswoman of the Year. I stood gracefully backstage, adjusting the delicate diamond clasp of my custom silk gown. The heavy, stifling curse of the strong black woman. The toxic expectation that I must quietly carry the crushing weight of everyone else's failures was permanently broken. I stepped out into the blinding warmth of the spotlight, greeted by a deafening standing ovation from the most influential leaders in the country. I walked to the polished glass podium and looked directly down at the front row. My three beautiful, thriving 2-year-old triplets were sitting happily on the laps of my elite legal and public relations team. David Harrison and my loyal executive assistant bounced the boys on their knees, while my lead publicist braided my daughter's curly hair. This was my chosen family. They were not bound to me by biological obligation, but by genuine mutual respect and unwavering loyalty. They were the people who stood firmly beside me when I bled, rather than the blood relatives who had maliciously tried to bleed me completely dry. Thank you for this incredible honor. I began, my clear voice echoing beautifully through the massive, silent ballroom. For generations, women who look exactly like me have been socially conditioned to believe that our ultimate value is inextricably tied to our infinite capacity for suffering. We are repeatedly told that to be a truly strong Black woman, we must endlessly sacrifice our own peace, our own wealth, and our own physical health to unconditionally support those who refuse to support themselves. We are heavily pressured to pay the generational Black tax to silently fund the reckless mistakes of entitled family members simply because we share a bloodline. I gripped the edges of the podium, projecting absolute authority. I stand before you tonight as living proof that true power begins the exact moment you firmly reject that toxic narrative. You do not owe your hard-earned success to parasites who only view you as a convenient financial bailout. You have the absolute, undeniable right to violently sever the heavy chains of familial extortion. Setting ironclad boundaries is not an act of hostility. It is an act of profound, necessary self-preservation. Family is not defined by the people who demand your money while aggressively disrespecting your character. Family is defined exclusively by the people who actively protect your peace. Celebrate your brilliant achievements and show up when you are fighting for your very survival. Choose yourself, build your own unshakable empire, and never apologize for fiercely guarding the gates. The massive ballroom suddenly erupted into thunderous emotional applause. Women throughout the audience stood to their feet, wiping away genuine tears of recognition and profound validation. I smiled radiantly, feeling an incredible, overwhelming sense of absolute liberation. Miles away from the glittering crystal chandeliers and the expensive champagne, a very different reality was playing out in a damp, poorly lit room. Marcus sat slouched in a cracked vinyl chair inside the depressing employee break room of the regional logistics warehouse. He wore a badly stained, ill-fitting gray uniform shirt that smelled faintly of exhaust fumes and stale coffee. His mandatory shift did not end for another 3 grueling hours, and his back ached fiercely from manually loading heavy shipping crates all evening. He stared blankly at the small, static-filled television mounted high on the cinder block wall. The local news station was broadcasting live coverage of my prestigious award ceremony. Marcus watched my glowing, triumphant face on the cheap screen. He saw the sheer magnitude of the immense wealth, the profound respect, and the beautiful, happy children he had so arrogantly thrown away for a fleeting, fraudulent illusion. The devastating weight of his colossal, irreversible failure crushed the last remaining breath from his lungs. His hands shook violently as he pulled out a cheap, prepaid smartphone. Desperation, thick and pathetic, consumed his broken mind. He hastily typed a pathetic, rambling message, blindly praying that the woman he had abandoned to die might harbor one tiny, lingering ounce of foolish mercy. Back in the luxurious VIP suite of the Civic Center, I sat comfortably on a plush velvet sofa surrounded by the joyful, echoing laughter of my children and my fiercely loyal friends. A waiter gracefully handed me a crystal flute filled with the most expensive vintage champagne in the building. As I raised the glass to my lips, my private mobile phone buzzed softly on the polished marble coffee table. I picked up the device and glanced casually at the brightly glowing screen. It was a very lengthy text message from an unknown, unregistered number. Simone, please, I am so incredibly sorry for absolutely everything. I was a blind, arrogant fool. I am living in absolute hell. I have lost my mother, my brother, and my entire life. Please, just let me see my beautiful children. I am begging you for one more chance to be a real family. I still love you. I read the pathetic, desperate words without feeling a single solitary fraction of pity, anger, or sadness. The man who sent that message was a complete stranger to me now, a pathetic ghost haunting the graveyard of his own terrible choices. I did not type a furious response. I did not demand an explanation or gloat over his profound misery. I simply tapped the screen twice, delete, block. I set the phone face down on the table, completely erasing him from my universe forever. I took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of my cold champagne. I looked at the incredible, thriving life I had brilliantly constructed from the ashes of their devastating betrayal. I was perfectly at peace, the sole absolute architect of my own magnificent destiny. If my journey has inspired you to cut off the toxic parasites in your life and fiercely reclaim your personal power, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more empowering stories of survival and absolute justice. Never lower your high standards to accommodate those who refuse to rise. Keep building your beautiful empire and never look back.